Thou Shalt Not Suffer a Witch by Dorothy Haynes. The child sat alone in her bedroom, weaving the fringe of the counterpane in and out of her fingers. It was a horrible room, the most neglected one in the house. The grate was narrow and rusty, cluttered up with dust and hair combings, and the floorboards creaked at every step. When the wind blew, the door rattled and banged, but the windows were sealed tight, webbed, fly-spotted, a haven for everything black and creeping. In and out went her fingers, the fringe pulled tight between nail and knuckle. Outside, the larches tossed and flurried, brilliant green under a blue sky. Sometimes the sun would go in, and rain would hit the window like a handful of nails thrown at the glass. Then the world would lighten suddenly. The clouds would drift past in silver and white, and the larches would once more toss in sunshine. "Janet, Janet," called a voice from the lad. "Where have you got to, Janet?" She did not answer. The voice went farther away, still calling. Janet sat in the bed, hearing nothing but the voice which had tormented her all week. "You'll do it, Janet, eh? Hey, Janet, and I'll give you a sixpence to spend. We've always got on well, Janet. You like me better than her. She never gave you ribbons for your hair, did she? She never bought you sweeties in the village. There's not much to ask of you, Janet, just to say she looked at you, and it happened. It's not as if it was telling lies. It has happened before. It has, eh, Janet?" She dragged herself over to the mirror, the cracked sheet of glass with the fawn fly spots. The door in her left hand, the window on her right, neither a way of escape. Her face looked back at her, yellow in the reflected sunlight. Her hair was the colour of hay, her heavy eyes had no shine in them. Large teeth, wide mouth, the whole face was square and dull. She went back to bed, and her fingers picked again at the fringe. Had it happened before? Why could she not remember properly? Perhaps it was because they were all so kind to her after it happened, trying to wipe it out of her memory. "You just came over faint, lassie. Just a wee sickness like. Oh, you don't need to cry. You'll be fine in a minute. Here's Minty to see you." But Minty would not see to her this time. The voice went on and on in her head, wheedling in one ear and out of the other. "Me and Jack will get married, see, Janet. And when we're married, you can come to see our house whenever you like. You can come in, and I'll bake scones for you, Janet. And sometimes we'll let you sleep in our wee upstairs room. You'll do it, Janet, will you not? For Jack as well as for me. You like Jack? Mind, he mended your dolly for you? And you'd like to see us married together, would you not? You'd never be happy married to her, Janet. You're a big girl now. You'll soon see that for yourself. She's good enough in her way, see, but she's not the right kind for him. She sits and sews and works all day, but she's never a bit of fun with him, never a word to say. But he's never been used to anyone better, see, Janet, and he'll not look at anybody else while she's there. It's for his own good, Janet, and for her sake as well. They'll never be happy married. And Janet, you're not going to do her any harm. Some day, you'll get married yourself, Janet, and you'll know. So it's just kindness. And she is like that, like what I said. Maybe she's been the cause of the trouble you had before. You never know. So you'll do it, Janet, eh? You'll do it." She did not want to. The door rattled in the wind, and the sun shone through the dirt and the raindrops on the window. Why did she want to stay here, with the narrow bed, the choked grate, the mirror reflecting the flaked plaster of the opposite wall? The dust blew along the floor, and the chimney and the keyhole howled together. "Janet, Janet," went the voice again. She paid no attention. Pulling back the blankets, she climbed fully dressed into the bed, her square, suety face like a mask laid on the pillows. "Janet, Janet," went the voice, calling, coaxing through the height of the wind. She whimpered and curled herself under the bedclothes, hiding from the daylight and the question that dinned at her even in the dark. "You'll do it, Janet, eh? Will you? Eh, Janet?" Next day the weather had settled. A quiet, spent sun shone on the farm, the tumble-down dikes and the shabby thatch. Everything was still as a painting. The smoke suspended blue in the air, the ducks so quiet on the pond that the larches doubled themselves in the water. Janet stood at the door of the byre, watching Jack Hislop at work. His brush went swish, swish, swirling the muck along to the door. He was a handsome lad. No matter how dirty his work, he always looked clean. His boots were bright every morning, and his black hair glistened as he turned his head. He whistled as his broom spattered dung and dirty water, and Janet turned her face away. The strong, hot smell from the byre made something grip her stomach with a strong, relentless fist. Now Minty came out of the kitchen across the yard with a basin of pigswill. With her arm raised, pouring out the slop, she looked at the byre door for a long minute. To the child, the world seemed to stop in space. The byreman's broom was poised in motion, his arms flexed for a forward push, his whistle went on the same high note, high and shrill. And Minty was a statue of mute condemnation, with the dish spilling its contents in a halted stream. A minute later, Janet found that Jack Hislop was holding her head on his knee. Minty had run up, her apron clutched in both hands. Beatrice, the dairymaid, was watching too, bending over her. There was a smell of the dairy on her clothes, a slight smell of sourness, of milk just on the turn, and her hair waved dark under her cap. There now, she said. All right, dearie, all right. What made you go off like that now? The child's face sweated all over. Her lips shivered as the air blew cold on her skin. All she wanted now was to run away, but she could not get up to her feet. What was it, Janet? Said the voice, going on and on, cruel, kind. Which was it? Tell me, Janet, tell me. She could not answer. Her tongue seemed to swell and press back on her throat so that she vomited. Afterwards, lying in bed, she remembered it all. The sense of relief when she'd thrown up all that she had eaten, and the empty languor of the sleep which followed. Beatrice had put her to bed and petted her and told her she was a good girl. It was easy done, eh, Janet? You'd have thought it was real. She gave a high, uneasy laugh. You're a good wee thing, Janet. All the same, you fair affected me at the beginning. She was glad to be left alone. After her sleep, strangely cold, she huddled her knees to her shoulders and tried to understand. Sometime, in a few months or a few years, it did not seem to matter. Minty and Jack Hislop were to be married. Minty was kind, since Janet's mother had died and she had been nurse and foster mother, attending to clothes and food and evening prayers. She had no time to do more. Her scoldings were frequent, but never unjust. Janet had loved her, till Beatrice came to the dairy, handsome, gay, and always ready with bribes. You're a nice wee girl, Janet. Look, will you do something for Jack and me? Just a wee thing. We've done it before, I know you have. Sometime, when Minty's there. And so she had done it, for the sake of a sixpence and the desire to be rid of the persistent pleading. But where she had meant to pretend to fall in a fit at Minty's glance, just to pretend, she had really lost her senses, merely thinking about it. She was afraid now of what she'd done. Was it true, then, about Minty? That the way she looked at you was enough to bring down a curse? It could not be true. Minty was kind, and would make a good wife. Beatrice was the bad one, with her frightening whispers, and yet it wasn't really badness, it was wisdom. She knew all the terrible things that children would not understand. Janet got up and put on her clothes. Down in the kitchen there was firelight and the steam of the evening meal. Her father was eating heartily, his broad shoulders stooped over his plate. All right again, lassie? He asked, snuggling her to him with one arm. She nodded. Her face still a little peaked with weakness. At the other side of the room, Minty was busy at the fireside, but she did not turn her head. Janet clung closer to her father. All the air seemed to be filled with whispers. From nowhere at all, the news spread that Janet was bewitched. She knew it herself. She was fascinated by the romance of her affliction, but she was frightened as well. Sometimes she would have days with large blanks which memory could not fill. Where had she been? What had she done? And the times when the world seemed to shrivel to the size of a pinhead, with people moving like grains of sand, tiny but much, much clearer, the farther away they seemed. Who was behind it all? When had it all started? In time, however, the trouble seemed to right itself. But now Jack Hislop courted Beatrice instead of Minty. Once, following them, Janet saw them kiss behind a hayrick. They embraced passionately, arms clutching, bodies pressed together. It had never been like that with Minty. No laughter, no sighs. Their kisses had been mere respectful tokens, the concession to their betrothal. Minty said nothing, but her sleek hair straggled. Her once serene eyes glared under their straight brows. She began to be abrupt with the child. Up the road, she would snap. How is it a bairn's at your elbow? Janet longed for the friendliness of the young dairymaid, but Beatrice wanted no third party to share her leisure, and Janet was more lonely than ever before. Why had she no friends? She had never had young company, never played games with someone of her own age. Her pastimes were lonely imaginings, the dark pretense of a brain burdened with a dull body. She made a desperate bid to recover her audience. Eyes shut, her breathing hoarse and ragged, she let herself fall to the ground, and lay there until footsteps came running and kind hands worked to revive her. So now she was reinstated, her father once more mindful of her, and the household aware of her importance, a sick person in the house. The voices went on whispering around her. Shh, it's wee Janet again. Fell away in a dead faint. Poor lassie. She'll need to be seen to. Janet, wee Janet. But this time, there was a difference. They waited till she waked and then questioned her. Her father was there, blocking out the light from the window, and the doctor sat by the bedside, obviously displeased with his task. Who was to blame? Who was there when it happened? She knew what they wanted her to say. She knew herself what to tell them. Who was it? Pressed her father. This has been going on too long. Who was it? Said the doctor. There's queer tales going around, you know, Janet. You know who it was, said the voice in her mind. You'll do it, Janet, eh? I don't know, she sighed, her eyes drooping, her mouth hot and dry. Only... She put her hand to her head and sighed. She could almost believe she was really ill. She felt so tired and strange. After that, the rumours started again. The voice came back to Janet, the urgent and convincing warning. She's like that, like what I said. For her own peace of mind, she wanted to know, but there was no one she could ask. She could not trust her own judgment. It was months before she found out, and the days had lengthened to a queer tarnished summer full of stale yellow heat. The larches had burned out long ago, and their branches drooped in dull fringes over the pond. The fields were tangled with buttercups and tall moon daisies, but the flowers dried and shriveled as soon as they blossomed. All the brooks were silent, and the nettles by the hedges had a curled, thirsty look. Janet kept away from the duck pond these days. With the water so low, the floating weeds and mud gave off a bad, stagnant smell. Over the flowers the bees hovered, coming and going endlessly to and from the hives. One day, a large bumble blundering home tangled herself in the girl's collar and stung her neck. She screamed out, running into the house, squealing that she had swallowed the insect and that something with a sting was flying around in her stomach, torturing her most cruelly. They sent for the doctor and grouped round her with advice. Later, they found the bee dead in the lace which had trapped it. But before that, she had vomited up half her inside, with what was unmistakably yellow bees' bodies, and a quantity of waxy stuff all mixed up with wings and frail, crooked legs. She looked at the watches and knew that the time had come. It was Minty Fraser, she wailed. It was her. She looked at me. She screamed and hid her face as the sickness once more attacked her in heaving waves. They went to the house and found Minty on her knees washing over the hearthstone. One of the farmmen hauled her to her feet and held her wrists together. Witch, 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 shouted the crowd at the door. What? Come on, witch, out to the crowd. No, I never. Leave her a minute, roared Jack Hislop. Maybe she... Give her a chance to speak. His mouth twitched a little. At one time he was thinking he had been betrothed to Minty before Beatrice told him. He faltered at the thought of Beatrice. Well, don't be rough till you're sure, he finished lamely, turning away and leaving the business to others. Those who sympathised with witches, he remembered, were apt to share their fate. The women were not so blate. Witch, witch, they shrilled. Burn the witch. Our beds are no safe when folks like her is let to live. She was on the doorstep now, her cap torn off, her eye bleeding, her dress ripped away at the shoulder. Janet's father, pushing through the mob, raised his hand for the sake of order. Look, men, listen there, this is my house. There'll be no violence done on the threshold. Hang her, burn her, a rope there. No hanging till you make sure. Swim her first, if the devil floats. Janet, here's Janet. The girl came through a lane in the throng, Beatrice holding her hand, clasping her round the waist. She did not want to see Minty, but her legs forced her on. Then she looked up. A witch. She saw the blood on the face, the torn clothes, the look of horror and terrible hurt. That was Minty. who cooked her meals and looked after her and did the work of a mother. She opened her mouth and screamed till the foam dripped over her chin. Her father's face was as white as her own spittle. "Take the beast away," he said, "and if she floats, for God's sake, get rid of her as quick as you can." It was horrible. They all looped at her, clutching and tearing and howling as they plucked at her and trussed her for ducking. She was down on the ground, her clothes flung indecently over her head, her legs kicking as she tried to escape. "It wasn't me," she squealed. "It wasn't me. I'm no witch." "Ah!" The long scream cut the air like a blade. Someone had wrenched her leg and snapped the bone at the ankle. But her body still went flailing about in the dust like a kitten held under a blanket. They had her trussed now, wrist crossed, legs crossed, her body arched between them. She was dragged to the pond, blood from her cuts and grazes smearing the clothes of those who handled her. Her hair hung over her face and her broken foot scraped the ground. "No, no," she screamed. "Oh, God." And once, "Janet, tell them it wasn't me." A blow over the mouth silenced her, and she spat a tooth out with a mouthful of blood. She shrieked as they swung and hurtled her through the air. There was a heavy splash, and drops of green, slimy water spattered the watching faces. If Minty was a witch, she would float, and then they would haul her out and hang her, or burn her away, limb by limb. She sank. The pond was shallow. But below the surface, green weed and clinging mud drew her down in a deadly clutch. The crowd on the bank watched her fascinated. It was only when her yammering mouth was filled and silenced that they realized what had happened, and took slow steps to help her. By that time, it was too late. What must it be like to be a witch? The idea seeped into her mind like ink, and all her thoughts were tinged with the black poison. She knew the dreadful aftermath. Long after, her mind would be haunted by the sight she had seen. In her own nostrils she felt the choke and snuffle of pond slime. But what must it feel like, the knowledge of strange power, the difference from other people, the danger? Her imagination played with the thrilling pain of it, right down to the last agony. She asked Beatrice about it. Beatrice was married now, with a baby coming, and Janet sat with her in the waning afternoons, talking with her, woman to woman. "I didn't like to see them set on her like yon. She never done me any harm. If it hadn't been for me—" "Are you sure, Janet? Are you sure? Mind the bees, Janet. On yon time at the barn door. What about them?" I don't know." "Well, I'm telling you, she was a witch, that one, if anybody was." "Well, maybe she couldn't help it." "No, they can't help the power, it just comes on them. Sometimes they don't want it, but it comes just the same. It's hard, but you know what the Bible says. Thou shalt not suffer a witch." She had a vision of Minty, quiet, busy, struggling with a force she did not want to house in her body. Beside this, her own fits and vomiting seemed small things. She could forgive knowing that. How do they first know they're witches?" she asked. "Mercy, I don't know. What questions you ask, Janet? How would I know, eh? I dare say they find out soon enough." So that was it. They knew themselves. Her mind dabbled and meddled uncomfortably with signs and hints. She wanted to curse Beatrice for putting the idea into her head. She would not believe it, but once there, the thought would not be removed. What if she was a witch? "I'm not," she said to herself. "I'm too young," she said. But there was no conviction in it. Long before she had been bewitched, she had known there was something different about her. Now it all fell into place. No wonder the village children would not call and play with her. No wonder her father was just rather than affectionate, shielding her only because she was his daughter. And no wonder Beatrice was so eager to keep in with her, with the incessant "age in it" always on her lips. Well then, she was a witch. As well to know it sooner as later, to accept the bothers with the benefits, the troubles and trances with the newfound sense of power. She had never wanted to kill or curse, never in her most unhappy moments, but now, given the means, would it not be well to try? Did her power strengthen by being kept, or did it spring up fresh from some infernal reservoir? She did not know. She was a very new witch, uncertain of what was demanded of her. Week after week passed, and she was still no farther forward. She continued her visits to Beatrice, though the thought of it made her grieve. It angered her to see the girl sitting stout and placid at the fireside, unhaunted, unafraid. You come and see the baby when it's born, eh, Janet? She'd say. Do you like babies, do you? Nothing mattered to her now, it seemed, but the baby. The dark winter nights, Janet made a resolve to kill her. But for Beatrice, she might never have discovered this terrible fact about herself. Beatrice was to blame for everything. But a witch has means of revenge, and one witch may avenge another. She had no idea how to cast a spell, and there was no one to help her. What had Minty done? She remembered the moment at the byre door, the upraised arm and the long, long look. Be easy. Bide her time, and Beatrice would die when the spring came. She sat up in the attic, twining her fingers in the fringe of the bed cover, in and out, under and over. Beatrice was in labour. It had been whispered in the kitchen, spreading from mouth to mouth. Now Janet sat on the bed, watched the larches grow black in the dusk. She was not aware of the cold or dirt or darkness. All her senses were fastened on the window of Beatrice's cottage, where a light burned and women gathered round the bed. She fixed her will, sometimes almost praying in her effort to influence fate. Kill her, kill her, let her die. Was she talking to God or to the devil? The thought stared and screamed in her mind. She wanted Beatrice to suffer every agony, every pain, and wrench, to bear Minty's pain and her own into the bargain. All night she sat, willing pain and death and suffering it all in her own body. Her face was grey as the ceiling, her flesh sweated with a sour smell. Outside an owl shrieked, and she wondered for a moment if it was Beatrice. Suddenly, she knew that it was all over. The strain passed out of her body, the lids relaxed over her eyes, her body seemed to melt and sprawl over the bed. When she woke, it was morning, and the maids were beaming with good news. Did you hear? They said. Beatrice is a lovely wee boy. She's fair away with herself. Janet said nothing. She stopped her mouth and her disappointment with porridge. It did not cross her mind that perhaps, after all, she was no witch. All she thought was that the spell had not worked, and Beatrice was still alive. She left the table and hurried over to the cottage. The door was ajar and the fire bright in the hearth, and Beatrice was awake in bed, smiling, the colour already flushing back into her cheeks. He's a bonny baby, Janet. He's lovely, eh? Eh, Janet? She crept reluctantly to the cradle. Why, he was no size at all. So crumpled, so new, a wee sliver of flesh in a bundle of white wool. She stared for a long time, half sorry for what she had to do. The baby was snuffling a little, its hands and feet twitching under the wrappings. He was so young. He would not have his mother's power to resist a witch. She glared at him for a long minute, her eyes fixed, her lips firm over her big teeth. His face, no bigger than a lemon, turned black, and a drool of foam slavered from the mouth. When the twitching stopped and the eyes finally uncrossed themselves, she walked out and left the door again on the latch. She had not spoken one word. It seemed a long time before they came for her, a long time of fuss and running about while she sat on the bed, shivering in the draught from the door. When she crossed to the window, her fingers probing the webs and pressing the guts from the plumpest insects, she saw them arguing and gesticulating in a black knot. Jack Hislop was there, and polished hair ruffled, his face red. The women were shaking their heads, and Hislop's voice rose clear in the pale air. Well, that's what she said. The wee thing had been dead for an hour, and it was that bitch Janet came in and glowered at it. Och, man, it's a sick woman's fancy. A wee mite that age can easily take convulsions. It wasn't convulsions. My wife said Janet was in and out with a face like thunder, and she was asking about witches too. You can ask Beatrice if you like. Well, she was in yon business at Minty Fraser. You can't blame her, a young lassie like that. Mind, we sympathise about the bairn, Jackie, but... They went on placating him, mindful of the fact that Janet was the farmer's daughter. It would not do to accuse her. But one of the women went into the cottage and came out, wiping her eyes. My, it would make anybody greet, the wee lamb's lying there like a flower that quiet. Been a fair shock to the mother, poor soul. She's gay fair through. they muttered then, and drifted towards the house. Janet left the window and sat again on the bed. She was not afraid, only resigned, and horribly tired of it all. When they burst into her room, clumping over the bare boards, her father was with them. They allowed him to ask the questions. Was he angry with them or with her? She could not guess. "Janet," he said sternly, "what's this? What's all this?" She stared at him. "What's all this? Do you know what they're saying about you? They say you killed Beatrice Hislop's bairn. Is that true, Janet?" She did not answer. Her father held up his hand as the men began to growl. "Come now, Janet, enough of this sulking. It's for your own good to answer and clear yourself. Mind of what happened to Minty Fraser. Did you do anything to the baby?" "I never touched it. I just looked at it." "Just looked?" "Yes." A rough cry burst from Jack Hislop. "Is that not what Minty Fraser said? Was that not enough from her?" "Hislop, hold your tongue or you'll lose your job." "Well, by God, I lose it then. There's been more trouble on this bloody farm." "I leave this to us. We'll question the wench. If she's no witch, she's nothing to fear." The women had come in now, crowding up in angry curiosity. The farmer was pushed back against the wall. "One word and you'll swim along with her," he was warned, and he knew them well enough to believe them. They gathered round Janet, barking questions at her, snatching at the answers. Every time she paused to fidget with the fringe, they lammed her across the knuckles till her hands were swollen and blue. "Tell the truth now. You a witch?" No, I'm not." "Why did you kill the baby this morning?" I never. I can't kill folk. You hear that? She can't kill folk. Have you ever tried?" She cowered back from them, the faces leering at her like ugly pictures. She would tell the truth, as her father said, and be done with all this dreamlike horror. "Leave me alone," she said. "Leave me, and I'll tell you." "Hurry then, out with it. Have you ever tried to kill anybody?" "Yes." "I tried, and I couldn't. It was her. She started telling me I was bewitched." "Who?" "Beatrice. Mistress Hislop." "My God," said Jack and her father, starting forward together. "Hold on there, let her speak." "She said I was bewitched, and I thought I was. I don't know if it was right. It was all queer, and I didn't know, and then when she said about witches, she put it into my head, and it came over me I might be one. I had to find out." "Aye, there you are. She's admitting it." "No," she began to shout as they laid hold of her, screaming in fright and temper till her throat bled. "No, leave me alone. I tried and I couldn't do it. I couldn't, I tell you. She wouldn't die. She'd have died if I'd been a witch, wouldn't she? She's a witch herself. I don't care, Jack Hislop, she is. It was her fault, Minty Fraser." "God, no." She could not resist the rope round her, the crossing of her limbs, the tight pull of cord on wrists and ankles. When she knew it was hopeless, she dared not resist, remembering Minty's broken leg had cuts and blood and bruises, the tooth spinning out in red spittle. She was not afraid of death, but she was mortally afraid of pain. Now, if she went quietly, there would only be the drag to the pond, muckle splash, and the slow silt and suffocation in slime. She had no voice left to cry out when they threw her. Her throat filled with water, her nose filled, and her ears. She was tied too tightly to struggle. Down and down she went, till her head sang and her brain nearly burst. But the pond was full with the spring rains, and her body was full-fleshed and buoyant. Suddenly the cries of the crowd burst upon her again, and she realized that she was floating. Someone jabbed at her and pushed her under again with a long pole, but she bobbed up again a foot away, her mouth gulping, her eyes bulging under her dripping hair. The mob on the bank howled louder. See, she's floating. Witch, burn her, fish her out and hang her. Well, there's proof now. What are you waiting for? What are you waiting for? Out with her. See, the besom will no sink. So now they fished her out, untied her, and bound her again in a different fashion. Hands by her side, feet together. She was too done to protest or to wonder what they would do. She kept her eyes shut as they tied her to a stake, and she ignored the tickle of dead brushwood being piled round feet and body. She could hardly realize that she was still alive, and she was neither glad nor sorry. They were gentle with her now, sparing her senses for the last pain. At first she hardly bothered when the smoke nipped her eyes and her nostrils. She hardly heard the first snap of the twin twigs. It was only when the flames lapped her feet and legs that she raised her head and tried to break free. As the wood became red hot and the flames mounted to bite her body, she screamed and writhed and bit her tongue to mincemeat. When they could not see her body through the fire, the screams still went on. The crowd drifted away when she lost consciousness. There was no more fun to be had. Or perhaps it wasn't such fun after all. The men went back to the fields, but they could not settle to work. Janet's father was gnawing his knuckles in the attic, and they did not know what would happen when he came down. Beatrice tossed in a muttering, feverish sleep. And beside the pond, a few veins and bones still sizzled and popped in the embers.